The grand chandelier sparkled above the elegant wedding hall, casting golden light across marble floors and crystal glasses. Guests in black suits and shimmering gowns whispered politely, their laughter blending with the soft sound of classical music. Waiters glided by with silver trays holding glasses of champagne. In the center of the room, the bride, a beautiful white woman in a flowing gown, stood beside her handsome groom, both surrounded by an air of wealth, celebration, and perfection. Behind the heavy velvet curtains, no one noticed a small pair of eyes watching. A young black boy, no older than 10, stood barefoot and trembling in the shadows. He wore torn brown pants and a shirt that hung from his skinny frame. His dark skin was covered in dust, and his empty stomach growled softly. But his eyes, sharp, determined, were fixed on one person in the room: the bride. No one had paid attention when he slipped in earlier, sneaking past the catering truck parked behind the hall. He had hidden behind crates, crawled past storage rooms, and watched the staff for weeks before this day. He wasn't here to steal. He wasn't here by mistake. He was here for something far more important, something that had kept him alive through hunger, rain, and years of silence. Clutched in his hand was a small, folded, crumpled photograph. He whispered to himself under his breath, "She's here. I know it." His voice was soft, filled with a mixture of fear and unshakable certainty. Earlier that evening, he had tried to approach a waiter, only to be shoved aside. A man had grabbed his arm roughly, but he wriggled free, ducking under a table, slipping through the crowd like a shadow. No one really saw him. They never did. He was small, fast, invisible. But now, he was close enough. The music was beginning. The host walked up to the microphone and called for silence. The bride turned toward the front with her bouquet in hand, smiling at her groom. That was the moment the boy moved. Darting from behind the curtains, his bare feet made light tapping sounds against the polished floor. Heads turned. Gasps spread through the hall. Confused murmurs filled the room. "Who let him in?" someone whispered. "He's filthy," another said. But the boy didn't stop. He reached the microphone before anyone could grab him. The host lunged, but the boy slipped past him. The groom's father, seated near the front, motioned furiously to security, but they were too far away. The boy stood in front of the microphone, breathing hard, his hands gripping the metal stand. His chest rose and fell rapidly. And then he spoke. The boy's voice trembled, but it echoed clearly through the sound system. The crowd fell silent, watching with a mix of shock, confusion, and disbelief. All eyes were now on this barefoot child, out of place in a world of silk and champagne. "I'm sorry," the boy began, his voice cracking slightly. "But I had to come. I had to say this." His small hand reached into the pocket of his torn shirt, and with great care he unfolded the wrinkled photograph. He held it up for everyone to see. It was faded, the edges torn, but still clear, a picture of a young woman kneeling in the rain, handing a blanket to a small, dirty boy who sat shivering on the street. The boy pointed to the woman in the photo. "This woman," he said, turning slightly toward the bride, "saved me. She gave me food. She gave me hope. I never forgot her face." A ripple of gasps moved through the audience. Guests leaned in closer. Phones were lowered. Laughter disappeared. The bride stood frozen, staring at the photo. Her expression shifted from confusion to recognition. Her hand rose to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Her lips trembled. The room around her blurred as the memory rushed back. Years ago, before she met her fiancé, before the designer gowns and diamond rings, there had been a night. A cold night, walking home from work, rushing through an empty street. She had seen him then, this very boy, huddled beside a market stall, soaked from the rain, his face pale and hollow. Without thinking, she had wrapped her own coat around him, given him the sandwich from her bag, and whispered, "Don't give up. Life will change. You'll be okay." She had never told anyone. Not her family, not her fiancé. It had been a quiet, fleeting act of kindness she thought no one remembered. Until now. The boy looked down for a moment, his voice softer. "After that night, I tried to find her. I didn't even know her name. But I remembered her words. I held on to them. I promised myself I'd find her again one day." No one moved. No one dared speak. The music had long faded. The lights above shimmered silently. Tears filled the bride's eyes. Her hands were shaking now. The boy looked up, his voice stronger. "There's more," he said, pausing as the guests braced for what would come next. "After she helped me, I ended up at a shelter. They fed me, gave me a place to sleep. They taught me to read. They saved my life." He turned toward the groom now, eyes wide and filled with emotion. "That shelter," he said slowly, "was run by your family's foundation." A wave of stunned whispers swept through the crowd. The groom's father sat back in his chair, speechless. He looked toward his son, then toward the bride, then back at the boy. His face was pale, his jaw tight with emotion. The bride couldn't hold her tears anymore. They streamed down her face as she pressed her hand to her heart. She stepped forward slowly, like someone walking through a dream. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh my God," she said. "It's really you?" The boy nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "I never forgot." The groom stepped forward too, taking the bride's hand in his. The boy stood before them, his shirt hanging loose on his thin body, his feet bare on the cold marble. Yet in that moment, he looked stronger than anyone in the room. From the front row, the bride's mother raised a trembling hand to her mouth. Guests wiped away silent tears. The groom's father stood, his expression unreadable. And then, the boy reached into his pocket once more. "I didn't come here to ruin your wedding," he said. "I came to deliver this." He unfolded a crumpled, handwritten letter, carefully smoothing it in his hands. All eyes were fixed on the boy as he unfolded the crumpled piece of paper with trembling hands. The worn-out page looked fragile, like it carried the weight of 1,000 memories. His small fingers smoothed the wrinkles carefully. The handwriting was faded in places, but still readable, delicate, neat, and full of meaning. The boy took a deep breath. The hall was so quiet now that even the chandeliers above seemed to have paused their shimmer. He began to read. "To the family whose kindness saved countless lives," he said, voice quivering but clear. Gasps echoed again. Guests leaned forward, their champagne forgotten. Many of them had never seen anything like this, never expected their perfectly polished evening to be pierced by such raw truth. "Please know that this boy standing before you is only one example of your goodness. His story is not unique, but it is real. And today, he comes not only to thank you." The boy paused, his eyes scanning the room. His voice dropped to a softer tone. "But to ask one thing." A wave of stillness swept over the crowd. Some hands were clasped together tightly, others covered trembling lips. The bride stood holding the groom's hand, her eyes swollen with tears but never leaving the boy's face. He continued, "Will you allow him to call this family his own?" The words fell like a stone in water, rippling through every heart in the room. "I have no parents," the boy said, folding the letter slowly. "I have no name that anyone calls, but I have hope, and today I came to be part of this day, if you'll let me." There was silence, and then a sound, a quiet sob from somewhere in the crowd. A woman wiped her eyes. Another man lowered his head, overcome. For a few seconds, even the cameras held by guests were forgotten. Everyone was simply human. The bride's hands were shaking as she took a slow step forward. Her lips trembled. "Yes," she whispered. She dropped her bouquet and knelt down before him, arms open. The boy didn't move at first. He simply stared, unable to believe what he was hearing. But then he took one small, shaky step, then another, and finally he collapsed into her embrace. She held him tightly, crying openly into his hair, whispering words no one else could hear. The groom moved beside them, crouching and wrapping his arms around them both. It was as if the air in the room had changed. The gold and crystal surroundings, the glamour, the music. None of it mattered in that moment. There was only the bride, the groom, and the little boy held tightly between them. From the head table, the groom's father stepped forward, slowly, with purpose. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes glistened. He knelt beside the boy and placed a large, gentle hand on his shoulder. "Young man," he said, his deep voice thick with emotion, "you honor us." "You're welcome here." The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide. No words came out, but the tears in his eyes said everything. The guests began to rise, slowly, instinctively. One began to clap, then another. Applause spread like a wave across the hall, not polite or rehearsed, but heartfelt, human, and full of awe. And then the bride turned to the boy. Would you walk with us?" she asked gently. The boy looked between them. This woman who once saved him with a coat and kindness, and this man whose family gave him a second chance at life. His face, streaked with tears and dust, broke into the faintest, most fragile smile. He nodded. "Yes." And so, the three of them, the bride, the groom, and the boy, stood together, hand in hand. The guests continued to applaud, many in tears, some whispering prayers, others simply watching in reverent silence. Outside, sunlight broke through the tall glass windows, pouring into the hall like a blessing. In that moment, something truly amazing had happened. As the bride, the groom, and the boy walked together toward the end of the aisle, the applause in the room softened, not from lack of emotion, but from reverence. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had become a moment people knew they would carry with them forever. Photographers stood frozen, unsure whether to capture the scene or simply witness it. The boy's small hand was clutched tightly in the bride's. On his other side, the groom held him protectively, like someone shielding something sacred. Every step they took echoed across the marble floor, not just in sound, but in meaning. Somewhere near the back of the room, a child whispered to their mother, "Is that boy their son now?" The mother didn't answer right away. Her eyes were wet. She nodded, silently. At the end of the aisle, the three stopped. The bride bent down and brushed dust gently from the boy's cheek. "What's your name?" she asked softly. The boy hesitated. I don't know." The bride blinked, startled. The groom knelt beside her. "You don't have a name?" he asked gently. The boy shook his head. "At the shelter, they just called me Kid, or Boy. Sometimes I made up names, but none of them were mine." The bride looked at the groom. They exchanged a glance. Something passed between them in that instant. An understanding. "What if," the bride said carefully, "we gave you one now?" The boy stared up at her, wide-eyed. "You mean I could choose?" She nodded, smiling through her tears. You could. He looked down at his dusty feet. For a moment, he was quiet. Everyone watched. The entire hall, though filled with people, felt still again. Then he looked up. I want something that means hope, he said. Because you, both of you, gave me that. The groom's father stepped forward again. I know a name, he said, clearing his throat. In Swahili, the word for hope is tumaini. It means to trust, to believe something good is coming. The boy whispered the word to himself. Tumaini. Then louder. Yes, that's my name. The crowd, already overwhelmed, reacted with a new wave of emotion. Some gasped. Others broke into quiet, grateful applause. The bride smiled through fresh tears. Tumaini, it's perfect. Suddenly, one of the younger guests, a girl around 8, stepped forward from the side of the aisle. She held a small flower from the decoration by her chair. She walked up to the boy, now Tumaini, and offered it to him. This is for you, she said shyly. Tumaini looked down at the flower, then back up at her. He accepted it carefully, as if it were made of glass. Thank you, he whispered. That was when the groom turned toward the officiant and said, Before we continue the ceremony, there's something we must do. He looked at the boy. Would you stand with us? At the altar? Tumaini blinked. Me? Yes, the bride said. We started this day thinking it was just our wedding. But it's more than that now. It's your beginning, too. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the front of the hall. The guests stood in silent respect. When they reached the altar again, the officiant looked at all 3 of them with wonder. I've performed many weddings, he said slowly, but today I witnessed the birth of something even greater than a marriage. The groom took a deep breath, his voice breaking slightly as he turned to the crowd. Our family didn't begin when we signed a certificate or exchanged rings. It began the day love took a stranger in. Today, we welcome someone not by blood, but by heart. Tumaini's eyes glistened. For the first time, he stood taller, straight, as if a heavy burden had finally lifted. The bride placed a hand on his shoulder. Whatever you need, we're here, for the rest of our lives. And with that, the ceremony resumed. Not with the traditional formality everyone had expected, but with something far more rare. A shared heartbeat among strangers who had, for one fleeting but unforgettable day, become a family. Outside, the sun continued to shine. A breeze passed through the towering windows, carrying with it the sounds of distant city life. But inside that grand hall, a different kind of life had just begun. One not planned, one not rehearsed, but one that no one would ever forget. As the ceremony continued, Tumaini stood beside the bride and groom, no longer a shadow in the background, but a presence that had redefined the meaning of family for everyone present. The officiant's words faded into the gentle hum of emotions swirling in the grand hall, and the boy stood tall. Not because he had grown in stature, but because the weight of loneliness had lifted from his shoulders. But not everyone in the room was at peace. Behind the outward smiles and glistening eyes, whispers began to stir among the guests seated. Further back, some from rival families, others from business associates, all impeccably dressed in shimmering gowns and sharp tuxedos. Not all of them understood. Not all of them approved. "Can you believe this?" one man muttered under his breath to his wife. "This is supposed to be the wedding of the year, and they've turned it into some kind of charity stunt." "Hush," his wife replied quickly, though her expression was unreadable. Elsewhere, a sharply dressed woman clutched her designer purse a little tighter. "It's sweet, yes," she whispered to the person beside her. "But Is it appropriate? I mean, this boy, no name, no background? Can they really trust? Enough, interrupted an elderly woman in pearls, her voice surprisingly firm. You just witnessed something sacred. Don't cheapen it with fear. Still, the tension hung in the corners of the room, like cobwebs untouched by the sunlight. The groom noticed it. His eyes swept the hall as he held his bride's hand. He could sense the silent questions, the discomfort hiding behind polite smiles. But he said nothing. For now. There would be time for conversations later. Right now, his focus was on Tumaini. The boy, unaware of the whispers, was absorbed in every second. He looked up at the bride as she exchanged vows with her groom. When the groom spoke, his words carried new weight, not just as a husband, but as a man whose legacy had unknowingly changed a child's life. I promise to stand with you, the groom said, eyes locked on the bride. In every moment of joy, every challenge, and in every choice that brings us closer to the life we want to build. Today, I marry not just the love of my life, but the woman whose heart changed another life before she ever met me. The bride's voice trembled as she replied, I promise to protect what we build together, and I promise to always listen to the world around us and to the hearts that cry softly in its corners. When the rings were exchanged, the officiant raised his voice slightly. Before I pronounce you husband and wife, I ask, is there anything else either of you would like to share? The groom turned to Tumaini. Is there anything you want to say? The boy blinked, startled. Me? The bride smiled. Yes, you're part of this moment too. Tumaini looked at the crowd. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. Was he allowed to speak here, truly? But then he saw her smile, the same one she gave him in the rain all those years ago. That smile was permission enough. He stepped forward. I just want to say, he began, voice small but steady, thank you. Not just to them, but to everyone who ever looked at someone like me and didn't walk away. You never know how much that means. A hush fell again, this time reverent. The officiant lowered his head respectfully. Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cheers erupted. But they were different from the usual wedding claps. They were soaked in emotion, heavy with new meaning. When the couple kissed, Tumaini clapped louder than anyone. A smile stretched across his face, wider than he'd worn in years, maybe ever. But as the celebration began, and guests began to move toward the banquet tables, behind the scenes, another conversation was beginning. The groom's father had stepped away into the hallway, whispering urgently into his phone. Get the director of the foundation on the line, he said. No delay. I want the boy's file in my hands by morning. His wife approached, confused. What are you doing? I want to know everything, he replied. Where he's from. What happened to his parents. How he ended up on the street. I want to make sure. Make sure of what? She asked, her voice sharp. That he's worthy? That this moment wasn't real? He hesitated. No, he said finally. I just want to understand what kind of story God just dropped into our lives. Meanwhile, back in the hall, Tumaini wandered toward the long banquet table. It was overflowing with food, roasted meats, pastries, fruits he didn't even recognize. For years, he had known hunger that gnawed at him like an animal. Now, he stood before abundance, unsure where to begin. A waiter noticed and approached. Hungry? The man asked kindly. Tumaini nodded. Yes, but not just for food. The waiter smiled, handing him a plate. Then take your time, kid. You've got a whole life ahead of you now. Tumaini turned back to the table, but in his heart, something whispered deeper. This wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Tumaini sat at the edge of the long banquet table, his plate resting in front of him, untouched. He stared at the food, gleaming dishes still steaming, sauces glistening in the candlelight, delicate pastries dusted with sugar and gold flakes. It was a feast fit for royalty. But for a boy who had once eaten scraps from trash bins, it didn't feel real. He tried a bite. Just one. The flavor was rich, buttery, sweet, and savory all at once. His eyes widened. He took another, then another. And slowly, the barrier that had kept him frozen began to melt. A few seats down, the bride was speaking with relatives, laughter in her voice. But every now and then, her eyes drifted toward the boy, checking on him like a mother would. The groom, too, kept glancing his way. Their wedding had become something else entirely, and they seemed more than okay with it. But not everyone was. From the far end of the room, a young man in a designer suit leaned toward his friend. "I don't get it," he muttered. "The kid just shows up, and suddenly he's family?" "It's a publicity move," his friend whispered back. "That's all. You'll see. This whole fairy tale won't last." They didn't realize the groom's mother was sitting just behind them. She heard every word. Without turning around, she said coldly, "Sometimes the things that last are the ones no one believed in." The two men fell silent. Meanwhile, the director of the foundation, the same man who had helped place Tumini into a shelter years ago, had arrived. He stood quietly near the entrance, watching the boy. His eyes were tired, but proud. The groom's father spotted him and quickly approached. "Tell me what you know," the father demanded. "Where did the boy come from?" The director sighed. "He was found near the old marketplace. No documents, no birth record. We believe he may have been abandoned at birth. No relatives? None that we could ever trace. He was in and out of shelters until he found us. He's always been quiet, bright, but distant." The groom's father crossed his arms. "And why today? Why here?" The director's voice softened. "Because he's been looking for her for years. The woman in the photo. He said she changed his life. And he promised himself if he ever saw her again, he'd thank her, no matter what it took." The older man was quiet for a long time. Then, "What does he want?" The director paused. "To belong. That's all." Back inside the hall, music began to swell again as the first dance started. The bride and groom took the floor, moving slowly, their bodies close, their hands locked tightly. The lights dimmed to a warm golden glow, and the chandelier above twinkled like a galaxy of stars. But just off to the side, Tumeni sat watching, still, quiet, unnoticed again. Until the bride turned mid-step, spotted him sitting alone, and whispered to her husband. Without breaking rhythm, the groom smiled. Then they both stepped back, turned, and extended their hands. To him, the music didn't stop, neither did the dance, but the meaning changed instantly. Tumaini looked up, confused. "Me?" The bride nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, come." The boy hesitated. His hands were shaking again. He rose slowly, walked to them, and stepped into the space they had opened between them. And in front of the entire room, they danced, not as bride and groom with a guest, but as a mother, a father, and a child. The crowd was still again. Some people stood, others wiped away silent tears. It wasn't perfect. Tumaini didn't know the steps. He stumbled, looked down, apologized, but the bride gently lifted his chin. "Look at me," she said. "You're not alone anymore." He nodded, and in that moment, surrounded by the swirl of silk gowns and clinking glasses, Tumaini danced. Not because he knew how, but because, finally, someone had asked him to. At the far edge of the crowd, the groom's father stepped into the light. His face was unreadable. For a moment, no one knew what he would do. Then he walked toward the trio, stopped in front of them, and extended his hand to the boy. Tumani stared, eyes wide. Slowly, he took it. The man bent slightly, his voice low. "You've been through more than I can imagine. But today, you gave us all something we didn't know we needed." He turned to the bride and groom. "If you'll have me, I'd like to be part of his journey, too." The bride smiled through tears. "Of course." And so they danced, for now. One family, not by blood, but by grace, by chance, by choice. Outside, the city lights flickered on, unaware of the miracle unfolding in the heart of a wedding that had become so much more. After the dance, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The music faded, replaced by a hush of awe, like everyone was waiting for the spell to break, but it didn't. The bride, groom, and Tumaini stood at the center of the floor, surrounded not just by applause, but by something more sacred: acceptance. Yet, as the celebration resumed, there was still something unfinished in Tumaini's heart. He had been seen, he had been welcomed, but the hollow space left by years of silence and survival wasn't filled by just kind words, or even tears. Something deeper inside him still whispered a question he hadn't dared say aloud. Who am I really? Later that evening, as guests moved to the dessert tables and laughter returned to the room like a tide coming back in, Tumaini slipped away from the crowd. No one noticed at first. He was still good at vanishing. He wandered through the ornate corridors of the estate, past marble busts, portraits in gilded frames, and windows that reached the ceiling. He found a quiet room, maybe a library or study, its door slightly ajar. Inside, golden light spilled from a single antique lamp beside a leather chair. The walls were lined with shelves of books, their spines worn with age. Tumaini stepped inside, pulled the door halfway closed, and sat down cross-legged on a rug near the fire. For the first time that day, he let himself breathe. A moment later, someone knocked softly. It was the groom's father. "I figured you might be in here," the older man said, not unkindly. Tumaini didn't move. The man entered quietly, not sitting, just standing near the fireplace. He looked down at the boy with a thoughtful expression, less the towering figure of wealth and power, and more like a man trying to understand something far outside his experience. "Do you know what your name means?" the man asked. Tumaini looked up slowly. "Tumaini? It means hope." He nodded. "It's Swahili, right?" "Yes." "Did you choose it?" Tumaini nodded again. "The shelter gave me a list. I picked that one, because it was the only thing I had." The man was silent for a moment. Then he pulled something from his coat pocket. An old photograph. It was the same one Tumaini had held earlier. The bride, years younger, kneeling in the rain, wrapping her coat around a small boy. The groom's father studied it. "She never told anyone about that night," he said. "Not me, not her mother, but it explains a lot about who she became." He placed the photo on the desk gently, then turned back to the boy. "You gave a speech today that shook this entire family. You reminded us what our foundation is supposed to stand for. Not numbers, not headlines, but faces like yours." Tumaini looked down at his knees, unsure how to respond. "I don't know what your life was before," the man continued, "and I won't pretend to understand your pain. But I do know this: if you'll allow it, we'd like to help you write the rest of your story." The boy's eyes filled, but he didn't let the tears fall. "Do you mean adopt me?" The man smiled, his voice catching. I mean, we want you in our lives. For good. That could mean adoption. Or maybe something else. You'll have a say in it, son. The word son landed like thunder in the quiet room. Tumaini swallowed. I've never had a family. I don't know how to be someone's son. The man knelt, reaching into his coat again and pulling out a folded piece of gold foil. He unwrapped it, revealing a makeshift crown made from a chocolate wrapper. My kids used to make these when they were little, he said with a chuckle. Said it made them feel royal. He placed it gently on Tumaini's head. It's just paper. But maybe it'll remind you. Being family doesn't mean you were born into it. It means someone saw you and said, you belong here. A sound came from the doorway. The bride stood there now, hand on her heart, tears in her eyes. Behind her, the groom watched silently, moved beyond words. Tumaini reached up and touched the crown. His lips trembled into a smile. Thank you. The bride stepped forward. Number? Thank you. She walked over, knelt again just like in the photograph, and wrapped her arms around him. This time, he didn't hesitate. He fell into the embrace like it was the only place he had ever wanted to be. The groom knelt beside them. The groom's father stood above them, the firelight casting long shadows behind him. And for the first time in his life, Tumaini didn't feel like he was outside looking in. He was home. Days passed after the wedding, but the story didn't end there. What happened that day had left a permanent mark, not just on the bride, the groom, or the boy, but on every person who had witnessed it. A video of Tumaini's speech, taken by one of the guests, had quietly made its way onto the internet. No one in the family had posted it, but someone had uploaded it anonymously with a simple title, The Boy at the Wedding. Within 24 hours, it had gone viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with comments, shares, and reactions. People from around the world were moved by the raw, honest voice of a child who had lived through so much, only to find love, family, and belonging in the unlikeliest place, a wealthy, glittering wedding. But while the world reacted, inside the estate, something else was happening. Something quieter, but far more important. Tumaini had moved in, not as a guest, not as a charity case, as family. At first, he didn't know what to do with the softness of the pillows, the warm meals that came without asking, the quiet knock on his door just to say, good night. He had trouble sleeping. He kept expecting it all to disappear. But every morning, someone was there. The bride, his new mother, would sit with him as he ate breakfast, her hair still messy from sleep, her robe trailing behind her. The groom, his new father, would ruffle his hair and ask him if he wanted to help pick a tie. It was a new rhythm, unfamiliar, but gentle. Still, there were moments that hurt, like when he walked past the hallway mirror and didn't recognize the boy staring back, clean, in fresh clothes, eyes wide with a fear he couldn't name. Or when he accidentally broke a vase and dropped to the floor, hands over his head, instinctively bracing for punishment. But no one hit him. No one yelled. They only knelt, held his face, and said softly, "It's okay. You're safe now." That broke him more than anything else. One afternoon, he wandered into the family's foundation headquarters for the first time. The receptionist looked confused, unsure how to address him. But the groom's father came down personally, put a hand on his shoulder, and said, "This young man? He's not a visitor. He belongs here." They gave him a tour, introducing him to people who worked every day to help other children like him. Tumaini walked through rooms full of donated clothes, food pantries, learning centers, and tiny beds made up with folded blankets. In one of those rooms, he stopped. It was just like the one he had stayed in years ago. A young girl sat on a lower bunk, staring at the wall, her shoes muddy and her eyes empty. Tumaini walked over slowly. She looked up, startled. "I used to sit like that too," he said gently. She didn't reply. He sat beside her. "It gets better. I promise. Still nothing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded paper crane he had been practicing making. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but someone gave me hope once. I think it's time I gave some too." She reached for it. Their fingers touched, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Back at the estate, the groom's father was on the phone with several board members of the family's foundation. "We're restructuring," he said. "Tumaini has asked that we focus more on outreach to street children and abandoned youth. He says they need to know someone is still looking for them." There was silence on the other end. Then, "You're letting a child dictate policy?" The old man chuckled. "Number, I'm letting someone with a lived truth guide our mission. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you've forgotten why we started this in the first place." He hung up, leaned back, and stared out the window. In the courtyard below, Tumaini was running, laughing, chased by the family's dog. The bride stood nearby with a cup of tea, her free hand on her growing stomach. Yes, she was pregnant now. They had told Tumaini gently, afraid he might feel pushed aside. Instead, he had cried with joy. "I get to be a big brother?" he whispered. "I never thought I'd get to be anything." A month later, on a quiet evening, the bride handed Tumaini a journal. "What's this?" he asked. "A story," she said. "Your story, the one you're writing every day." He flipped through the blank pages. Then he looked up. "Will you help me write it?" She smiled. "No, sweetheart. You're the author now." And so, under the soft light of a setting sun, in a home that had once been only a dream, Tumaini began to write, not just with a pen, but with the living proof that he was no longer a shadow in someone else's story. He was the hero of his own. Seasons passed. The estate, once cold and distant in Tumaini's memories, now pulsed with life. Laughter echoed through the halls. The once solemn portraits on the walls seemed to smile a little brighter. A year had passed since that unforgettable wedding. A year since a barefoot boy stepped onto a marble floor and changed everything. Tumaini was no longer a stranger in his own story. His hair was longer now, a little curlier. He'd grown taller, filled out. The worry in his eyes had softened, replaced with something deeper, confidence, even peace. He had started school. He struggled at first, the other kids not knowing what to make of him. But soon they came to understand. He wasn't just smart. He was brave. He joined a writing club. He told stories, his own, but also made-up ones about boys who flew with wings made of trash bags, or girls who could find treasure by following the wind. His teacher said he had the soul of a storyteller. At home, everything changed when the baby was born. A girl. They named her Grace. The day Tumaini held her for the first time, something inside him cracked wide open. She was so small, so new, so untouched by the coldness of the world. He kissed her forehead, whispered to her like someone once had whispered to him, "Don't give up. Life will change. You'll be okay." He meant it this time, because now he was part of the reason life changed. The boy looked up. "Okay." So Tumaini began to speak, and the boy listened, wide-eyed, like someone who had just found a lighthouse in a storm. Before they left, Tumaini turned to the shelter director. "I want to volunteer here, once a week, every week." "You sure?" she asked gently. It might be hard to keep reliving all this. Tumaini looked back at the hallway behind him. That place made me who I am, but I don't live there anymore. I live in the after now. Months later, the family hosted a charity gala in the same grand hall where the wedding had taken place. The chandeliers sparkled again. The guests wore their gowns and tuxedos, but this time things were different. There were photos on every wall, not of the wealthy, but of children who had been saved. Faces smiling, hands held, blankets wrapped around shoulders. And in the center of it all stood Tumaini, not barefoot, not hiding. He wore a simple black suit, his first ever. A silver pin on the lapel, an open book with wings. When the host called his name, he stepped onto the stage without fear. The same microphone stood waiting. He didn't tremble this time. He began, "1 year ago, I came here with dust on my skin and no name in my heart. I had no home, no future, and no place in this world. But someone saw me. Someone listened. Someone believed I could be more." The room was silent. He paused, then continued. "Today, I have a question. It's a question I've asked myself for a long time. Who am I?" He took a breath. "I'm not just a story of pain. I'm a story of what happens after. I'm a son, a brother, a student, a writer, a friend." He smiled softly. "And today, I choose my name. Not the one the shelter gave me. Not the one printed on a file. My real name. The one I earned." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. It read, "Tumaini Grace Alcott." Gasps rose. The bride, his mother, stood, tears in her eyes. The groom held her hand. The crowd rose in applause. But Tumaini wasn't finished. "There are more kids out there like me, still hiding, still waiting. So tonight, I ask you, don't just give your money. Give your ears. Give your time. Give your attention. Because you never know who you might be saving." He stepped back from the mic. A standing ovation followed. Outside, under the stars, Tumaini sat on the garden steps. The bride came and sat beside him, holding baby Grace. "You picked our name," she whispered, brushing his cheek. "I earned it," he replied. She nodded. "Yes, you did." He looked up at the stars. "Do you think the little boy I was would recognize the person I became?" She smiled. "He wouldn't just recognize you, he'd be proud of you." And for the first time in his life, Tumaini believed it. He closed his eyes. The boy in the rain was gone. The boy in the story was home forever.